Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a privilege for me to be invited to deliver the Sardar Patel Memorial Lecture this year, which will be broadcast on the All India Radio as it conventionally is on the 31st of October this year. As time passes by, the contribution of greatness of Sardar Patel is increasingly felt almost by the day. An unquestionable first-rank leader of the freedom movement. I think the best in the Sardar was to come immediately after independence. He didn't live very long after independence, just about 2.5 years. And in that short period, this country owes its present geography literally to him. The challenges we faced, both in the transfer of power and the integration of states, two subjects which he handled immediately upon independence, both very well documented by V.P. Menon in his two legendary books, actually throw light on the greatness of the Sardar. He persuaded people. He influenced the rulers. And as is said in our convention, he pulled out every card in order to ensure that India attains its present geography. The manner in which he handled Junagadh, the manner in which he handled Hyderabad, Travancore, Cochin, Bhopal, these were not easy states to handle in the process of integration of the states. And before he left us, literally within a matter of months since independence, India had acquired that one identity. If Gandhiji had probably the greatest contribution in the independence struggle, I have not the least doubt that the integration of this country and its present geography, the largest credit goes to the leadership of the Sardar itself. And yet he was not a highly glamorized personality. Not many knew his entire background. I asked a group of my political colleagues the other day as to what their impression was as to which profession he originally belonged to. And because of the famous Satyagraha, they thought he was a farmer. He was actually one of the most distinguished barristers of pre-independence India. And unlike his other colleagues, a practicing one at that. They did realize only in the 1970s that there was no official biography of the Sardar. Till Shri Rajmohan Gandhi was requested by the Sardar Patel Trust to author his biography. And in the opening chapter, he mentions that the greatest challenge was for him to find out the photograph and the name of Sardar's wife. Since unquestionably he had not been one of those who was officially glamorized. And he explains the details of the research that he had to do to find out her name, which he finally did discover. But nobody could ever produce a photograph of the wife, and therefore that's never available. And I think it's a fitting tribute to him that as time passes by, his greatness and contribution is more and more realized in Indian society. I'm conscious of this fact, as you mentioned, that this lecture in his memory Though most of us thought he was India's first Home Minister, he was also India's first INB Minister, which has been dedicated to his memory, has been delivered by very distinguished speakers in the past. Mr. Seth mentioned that the first one was delivered by Shri C. Rajgopalacharya. Thereafter, amongst others who've delivered the lecture is Dr. Zakir Hussain, President Abdul Kalam. And I'm conscious of the fact that I am completely unequal in that task to most of them, particularly on a subject which itself has now become a puzzle in itself. A puzzle because you start with one of our most cherished fundamental rights of free speech. The changing landscape and restrictions to a right. And ordinarily, restrictions are never popular subjects. They are considered an erosion of the right. They are considered, at times, even retrograde. And in today's world of technology, even impossible to implement. Many believe, and I am one of those who do believe, that the age of bans is now over. It's literally impossible, if not very difficult, to implement them. And therefore, an academic understanding of this subject would be extremely necessary. If I go back to the days of the Constituent Assembly, the present Article 19 was then, in the draft Constitution, Article 13. And when it was designed as freedom of speech and expression, I don't think anybody had any doubt about retaining that as a fundamental right. The debate, however, was, should there be a separate right for the media? The media was extremely important. One of the members, Shri Devendra Sarup Seth, actually proposed that media must be a separate fundamental right. And a large number of members then grouped up and suggested a fundamental right which would not only be free speech or expression, but also include phrases like thought, worship, publication, and press. The choice, therefore, was, should the phraseology of the Constitution be extremely crisp and specific, or should it be very long-winded? Mr. Iyengar and Dr. Ambedkar then had to intervene, and there are detailed, very explicit speeches by them as to how the phrases speech and expression would actually cover each of these fundamental rights. And therefore, there was no necessity or need to incorporate each one of those other expressions which were being mentioned. The next question was, is it an absolute right, or is it a right subject to reasonable restrictions? Now, this obviously was a case in the context of each one of the fundamental rights which was included in Article 19. But the political thought which went behind the craftsmanship of the article obviously had to concede, and rightly so, that the right is not absolute. The right is subject to reasonable restrictions. But then, is the right subject to reasonable restrictions, or must the reasonableness of the restriction itself be defined? Because if there is an abstract phrase like a reasonable restriction, its width and ambit could be very large. And therefore, the craftsmanship of the Constitution was that as far as Article 19(1)(a), the fundamental right of free speech and expression was concerned, it was subjected to a reasonable restriction, but these could not be any generalized reasonable restrictions. These were specifically defined reasonable restrictions with which there must be a nexus. And that is where 19(1)(a) became different from the other fundamental rights. So all other fundamental rights had reasonable restrictions, quite general and vague, from Article 19(3) to 19(6). But the original Constitution had reasonable restrictions which were very specific. So the reasonable restriction had to be by law, and that law would relate to only the following: libel, slander, defamation. Now this would be one category itself. Contempt of court, or any matter which offends against decency or morality, and the next phrase was important, or undermines the security of or tends to overthrow the state. So only those reasonable restrictions were possible which were A, reasonable, B, imposed by law, and C, had to have relationship with either one of the defamation offenses, contempt of court, decency, morality, or security of the state, or which undermined the security of state or would overthrow the state. Now, when the Constitution was put into practice, what if somebody was not going to overthrow the state or indulge in an act of sedition or a threat to the security of the state, but made a statement, let us go and set the legislature on fire? Did he have a right to say this? And therefore, the very first amendment to the Constitution, they realized that the phraseology required to be changed. So in the very first amendment to the Constitution itself, these phrases were changed. And the phrases became reasonable restriction to be imposed by law on the exercise of the right conferred by the said subclause. The word undermines the security was changed and was replaced by the word in the interest of security of the state. For some reason, a second restriction was brought in: friendly relations with foreign states, public order, which was not there earlier, decency, morality, contempt, defamation, and another new one was introduced, or incitement to an offense. So in 1952 itself, the very first change that was made was that the word undermines the security got replaced by the words interest of security, public order, friendly relations with neighbors, and incitement of an offense became a ground for reasonableness as far as the offense is concerned. Now, these are the restrictions which from the early 1950s have always continued. The few important factors in this to be noticed are: one, that free speech and expression got a preeminent right. It's been more preeminent than other fundamental rights because in this context, as I've already mentioned, the restriction had to be specific in character. The second important aspect of free speech has been that we've seen the ups and downs of other fundamental rights. We've seen other fundamental rights being strengthened, being weakened. For instance, personal liberty and life got significantly weakened during the emergency. The right to free trade itself, in the era of regulated economy itself, got weakened by several steps. But as far as Article 19(1)(a), free speech and expression has been concerned, a broad judicial policy has also been that with every judgment, it broadly has been strengthened and never narrowed down. So a national policy of expanding and strengthening the right itself has continuously existed over a period of time. So if we look at the important aspects of the right, how it has been indirectly supported, if I leave out the earlier two cases of Ramesh Thapar and Brij Bhushan, some of which were the licensing cases, can you impose an excessive license fee on a newspaper? They said, no, you can't. Now from electronic media, when we transgressed and transformed into the social media, is the IT Act case, the Section 66A case as it's popularly known, the Shreya Singhal case. Now the Information Technology Act enacted several years ago, Section 66A was a very badly drafted provision. The width and ambit of 66A was much wider than the restrictions of Article 19(2). The only restrictions which can be imposed are the restrictions which are envisaged in Article 19(2). The moment you travel beyond the 19(2) restrictions, you violate the right of free speech. Now, irrespective of the medium, that principle will hold, whether you are speaking in a public meeting, an auditorium meeting, on television, in the print media, or on the social media. And I think the court had the challenge before the court was a legitimate one. But there are two views. 66A had two categories of provisions. The first category was those which were within the limitations of Article 19(2). And the second category went outside 19(2). So if 66A had been properly drafted to only include the 19(2) restrictions, such as security, public order, and the like mentioned in 19(2), 66A would have been constitutionally compatible. But the moment it says it causes annoyance, it causes anger, now these are very vague phrases. And therefore, anger, annoyance is not something which is mentioned in Article 19(2). And obviously, these phrases had to be struck down for the asking. Any young student of law would even tell you this. I had, as the leader of opposition, an opportunity to discuss this in Parliament, and I had exactly raised the same content in my address in Parliament at that time, saying that 66A and some of the regulations framed therein wholly go outside 19(2), and therefore the government must seriously think of changing some of these provisions. The court therefore had two options. The first option was to invoke the doctrine of severability. And under the doctrine of severability, the court could have protected the constitutional provision and struck down the unconstitutional provision. That was a logical approach possible. The court, however, said, we've tried to invoke the doctrine of severability because our first attempt is to save as much as is constitutional. And for reasons that they mentioned in the judgment, they said, severability doesn't appear to be possible in this case. And therefore, it's so badly drafted that to pierce, to cut out the provision and take out the constitutional aspect and save it from the unconstitutional aspect would involve rewriting the law itself, which we are not willing to do. And therefore, the court decided to strike down everything, the constitutional and the unconstitutional together. And therefore, the option only is that the restriction, if it ever comes, could only be constitutional and never unconstitutional itself. That is where today we stand as far as the evolution of these restrictions is concerned, and how each one of those restrictions has been consistently dealt with, and the inherent content of the right itself has been widened, so that the impact of the restrictions itself has been lowered down. There's a second important aspect of this subject. And the second important aspect is, what is this changing landscape of the content of the right? The content of the right has expanded. The medium also has changed. Now, you had a medium in terms of the conventional medium where it was newspapers, it was books, it was meetings, it was the right of speech. And the right was restricted to these areas. And then suddenly came the impact of the electronic media. Satellite itself brought about a significant change. And as far as the present subject is concerned, the most significant change that it brought about was, it changed the definition of news. News is no longer what you read in the newspaper next day. News is no longer conventional reporting. News is, even the restraints which the print media used to, self-restraint it used to follow, itself got significantly altered. News was more sensational. News was what television cameras could capture. What cameras can't capture won't be news. A major Africa summit will be some news, but a young girl returning home from Pakistan will be big news, because the television captures it differently. On international relations, the speeches are something which television doesn't ordinarily like to capture. It's not a grievance, but that's a hard reality. And therefore, the definition of news itself had changed. The second significant change which has taken place is that there is now a sea change between, and a difference between, actual news and channel-driven news. There's an actual news of things which are happening all over the world. And there's a channel-driven news. There's a news item which appeals to a channel, it builds it up during the course of the day, it restricts its descriptions on that, and therefore you get those one or two news items which are channel-driven news. I think what is happening is that whereas the marketeers of news express their right to free speech, the viewer or the reader's right to information and the right to knowledge itself is also being impacted. Today, the right of free speech and expression, as it has been widened in all these judgments that jurisprudentially widened, is also the viewer's right to know, the reader's right to knowledge. Therefore, in the newsprint case, when the tax was struck down, an expression was used, it's a tax on knowledge. And therefore, you now have opinions that what is also important is not only the person who supplies or markets the news, but it also, the viewer's right is also a part of Article 19(1)(a). So when only limited channel-driven news is delivered to the viewer, and the whole landscape of information is held back from him, I think there is a contraction as far as the viewer's right to knowledge is concerned, that he's also entitled to a wholesome news and information of what's happening across the world. I think the next important change has been the empowerment through the social media itself. And that is where I think the subject of restrictions will bear some relevance. The empowerment of the social media itself is, a citizen has acquired a voice. He's also started expressing himself. He's also using the forum. He uses the forum to express his views. He uses the forum to express his reactions. Decision makers now rely on social media also to realize which way opinion is swinging. People use the social media in order to convey their own opinions and views on various subjects. And I think it's an extremely powerful instrument of governance itself. Free speech actually is an aid to good governance because aspects of governance itself are highlighted through the expression of free speech and opinion, including contrarian views. I have not the least hesitation in admitting, though a late entrant over the last few years, I have been using the social media essentially to express my own opinion. And therefore, whenever you want to contribute to a public debate on some issue, you have to write your views, and therefore the media organization and your own followers decide whether your views are worth it or not, and worth commenting on it or not, and are you able to set the agenda by the own expression of opinion or not. And I think, therefore, there is a powerful tool. Because it's an unregulated medium, there is also a very large amount of false, defamatory content in it. And some content which could even do some damage to the social fabric of the society itself. Extreme views also find a lot of mention. And thereafter, you have to rely on a sense of fairness of those who participate in social media and who grasp information through social media as to their own ability to filter out information itself. Where does that lead us in the area of restrictions now? If we see the entire development of law which shows the content of the right has increased, if we see the evolution of technology, the expanse of expressing the right itself has increased, where is now the space for restrictions? The law and the Constitution are absolutely clear. Those who framed the Constitution and those who brought out the First Amendment to the Constitution are clear